So we Bitcoiners spend a lot of our time talking about how Bitcoin's technology is great, and it is. However, Bitcoin's technology is not perfect, and there are some challenges and issues and some problems that could eventually cause Bitcoin to fail spectacularly. And I think it's good to spend some time to think about all these issues. And this panel is not about solving these issues. This panel is about realizing that there are problems and what they are, so that maybe eventually we will be able to solve them. So we'll start this off by each panelist first introducing himself and then talking 2 or 3 minutes about his favorite challenge to Bitcoin. And later on we will discuss all these issues. So I will start. I'm Meni Rosenfeld. I'm the chairman of the Israeli Bitcoin Association. But in addition to that, I'm also a mathematician. I did a master's degree in the Weizmann Institute of Science. And ever since I heard about Bitcoin 3.5 years ago, I've spent some time researching all kinds of problems relating to the algorithms and mathematical matters in Bitcoin. And I think that the main innovation in Bitcoin, what set Bitcoin apart from everything that came before it, is the invention of using proof of work to synchronize transaction, also known as mining. And this is Bitcoin's greatest strength, but I think it's also its greatest weakness, because even though it solves this problem, it also has a lot of potential attacks against it, where the idea is that if some entity controls a large amount of mining power and it tries to use it maliciously, then there are a lot of attacks it can do. So this isn't a problem as long as the honest Bitcoin network is large enough. However, recently there's been some research, for example, the research of Lir Bahak, where it turns out that even less than a majority of the network is enough to commit some attacks. And there's a big problem on how to incentivize the honest nodes. Because, right now, Bitcoin miners are incentivized with the new Bitcoins that are generated. And often someone who is new to Bitcoin asks, yeah, but what will happen when Bitcoin mining stops and so on? And everyone who knows a thing or two explains that Bitcoin mining is not going to stop. There's going to be transaction fees. But that's not really a complete solution, because we don't know how much the transaction fees will be in the future. We don't know how to keep them at a high enough level. And there is the problem of tragedy of the commons, which may cause the transaction fees to be very low and not enough to incentivize enough miners to fight off any potential attack. So this is an issue. There are a lot of related issues to this problem, and maybe we'll explore it in more depth afterwards in the panel. So that's it. So Aviv,
should I just introduce myself, or also give a little bit of my...
Yeah, you can say a bit about yourself. Yeah.
Okay. So I suppose you've seen me earlier today. I'm Aviv Zohar. I'm a senior lecturer at the Hebrew University, and I research a lot of things about Bitcoin. Not all of them are really about its security. I do a lot of research about incentives in the protocol and its scalability. Recently, I've also started looking at some of the security aspects. And I suppose I'll tell you about what I think will destroy Bitcoin in a big bang in a little while.
I'm Peter Todd. I work as a Bitcoin Core developer and consultant. And I've got my own ideas on how to destroy Bitcoin. I go charge, if you wish to, any NSA in the audience, and pass it on.
My name is Nahum. I'm the founder of Green Address. I got a background in computer science with distributed systems, and I worked my entire career in financial service industry.
Hi, my name is Gill, Assayag. I'm a computer science and biology graduate. Love Bitcoin. I have a financial instrument company that's algo trading, and I'm going to tell you how Bitcoin is going to be destroyed soon.
I'm Shaul Kfir. I'm Director of Technology at Bits of Gold, and now a new company called LedgerLock, which has to do with Bitcoin security, exactly because we believe this is one of the larger problems. Formerly, I worked with Eli Ben-Sasson at Skipper Lab. You'll hear his talk later on Zero Cash.
Okay, so you can go ahead and talk about your favorite threat to Bitcoin.
Okay, so one of my favorite threats is just plain old hacking. I think we're going to see in the next few years a lot of big heists of Bitcoin. There are solutions to a lot of the problems I believe that will happen. There's a lot of great work done by Lawrence at Green Address, which will mitigate the threat. The problem is I think most users still aren't tech savvy enough to use all of these solutions. So, for example, we saw the Heartbleed bug a few months ago, and I wanted to illustrate a scenario where the Heartbleed bug, for whoever isn't familiar with it, it was a bug where you could hijack a secure session between a server and an end user, and then you could be a man in the middle and pretend to be the server, and the person on the other side doesn't know that he's actually talking to a fake server. That's a simplification of the bug, but this bug has been in OpenSSL, one of the largest security libraries used today. It's been in it for 3 years, since 2011, and only caught now. So let's imagine that someone was exploiting this bug, and now they've been doing man-in-the-middle attacks for quite some time on blockchain info, which has a few million wallets. In that time, nobody would know that they've hacked. They could once in a while randomly send people different sessions, send them a slightly different version of the blockchain info wallet. And then while you think you're signing a Bitcoin transaction as you always did, it's also leaking a little bit of your private data, or maybe even your whole private key. It's leaking it to some hacker. So now we may have a hacker out in the loose, which we don't know even today, that has a whole lot of private keys of a lot of the people sitting here with the blockchain info wallet. Someday in the future, he decides, okay, I have enough private keys, and just sends him a bunch load of transactions and compromises a lot of the blockchain info wallets. In that case, I think that may be a psychological deterrent that would be a huge threat to Bitcoin, where people totally lose faith in the system because of one or a few big hacks.
Okay. You can leave your eyes open or you can close them, but try to imagine that coming back home, you have an email waiting in your inbox with a PDF attached, and the title is Perfect Coin. It's written by Sushi Nakamoto. It's 6 pages long white paper, and it solves all of the problem of Bitcoin, which are user experience, scalability issues, volatility. Some people think that the mining is not fair today, and introducing smart contracts and more. This will may lead to huge mainstream adoption and inherit Bitcoin's place as a leading cryptocurrency. Bitcoin core developers will want to take in features from that coin to try to save Bitcoin, if it's possible at all. Most miners will object because, hey, that's our money. We invested so much money in these mining machines. And then there will be a hard fork in Bitcoin, which will lead to people losing trust, and the value will drop even more, which will contribute to perfect coins adoption, make it even stronger. And it might happen, even Ethereum might be perfect coin. We don't know yet.
I have 2 scenarios I'm thinking in terms of something that could impart or incomplete destroy Bitcoin confidence. One is reliance on zero confirmation. Today, some people do it, and I believe it can be done to a certain extent. But as the block reward halves, eventually the miner fees are going to be a big part of what miners get. And eventually, miners are going to have an incentive in accepting transaction that give them a higher fee. So eventually they will support what is now called replace by fee. So something that allows anyone at any point in time to pretty much double spend. So relying on that, I'm not sure it's going to be great going forward. But the other thing I wanted to touch was user passwords. So users are terrible at picking passwords with good entropy. And many services today are taking your private keys and then encrypting them with your password, and then storing them at their own server. These services are not unhackable. Many sites have demonstrated that nobody's unhackable. And if these databases get dumped, it's going to be trivial to try to brute force the fattest wallets, possibly with the easiest passwords, dictionary passwords. And GPUs today can do even up to 10 million passwords attempts a second. And you can do better with FPGAs, and with big money, you can do even better with ASICs. So these two, I think, are quite important.
With response to Perfect Coin, I think Perfect Coin's biggest problem is going to be that the Bitcoin community will say, you know what, let's just take the Perfect Coin source code and add the Bitcoin UTXO set and give everyone Perfect Coins based on how many Bitcoins they have. My other one, though, is this notion that, and this is kind of extending on transaction fees, and also it's sort of also an industry problem, too, is that Bitcoin tends to not be very competitive against other solutions. You know, the one thing it can really offer the world is decentralization, and because of decentralization, freedom from regulation. So it can be outcompeted. You know, as an example, industry can outcompete it by simply offering better banking services. You know, I'm sure if PayPal had more reasonable policies, there'd be a lot less excitement about Bitcoin among a lot of the community. And equally, even within Bitcoin, as an example, if you need transaction fees to pay for mining in the future, well, there's an incentive to go create systems that bypass Bitcoin, such as hub-and-spoke micropayment channels, off-chain transaction systems, you know, this whole variety of schemes to avoid actually having to use the Bitcoin network. And I think it's very likely that very little of the traffic will end up on the Bitcoin network in the future. And I think we're already seeing this bit by bit as well with systems like Coinbase, which send money instantly from one customer to another without ever hitting the blockchain. And equally, you also have the problem that the inflation subsidy becomes less and less important as Bitcoin, the technology, becomes used for a wider variety of things. And again, this is one of those things where it's not clear exactly how you go pay for mining security. Is it the inflation reward we already know is dropping because of the pre-programmed every 4 years halving. But even prior to that, we can go and have less of the value in the ecosystem being Bitcoin itself and more of the value being things like colored coins and so on. You know, it's easy to imagine a world where Bitcoin, the currency, is outcompeted by colored coins that represent, say, US dollars. And if you have some issuers who become reasonably trustworthy, well, now I can go send US dollars around the world, which is what I actually want to do, rather than having to go send Bitcoins around the world. Again, it's being outcompeted. And I'm not really clear what to do about that.
All right. So I have two ways I can think of in which Bitcoin will go kaboom. So the first one, I suppose, if you have to choose between a conspiracy or human error usually wins, and we've seen a human error enter Bitcoin at some point, right? And we experienced a hard fork in the chain because of an inconsistency between versions, and that was a relatively minor event in comparison to what would happen if this. If Bitcoin was actually successful, and you'd suddenly see a hard fork, and you couldn't pay at the supermarket or something like that for a few hours. Think of the entire financial system being paralyzed. That's pretty bad. So of course that could be by mistake, or if somebody, I don't know, hacks into GitHub or I don't know what, and gets a lot of miners to download a different version of the code and upgrade. That's very simple, I suppose. My second doomsday scenario is more along the lines of a connectivity disruption in the network. And I'm not talking about a connectivity disruption in the internet, but suppose somebody, for example, bought a lot of IP addresses and connected them to maybe just 1,000 computers, which is not very difficult to do now that you have cloud computing, and decided to establish a lot of Bitcoin nodes and to attract a lot of connections in the Bitcoin network. And after embedding himself deeply into the Bitcoin network as a lot of relay nodes, at some point, managing to isolate different nodes in the network from the others, or to partition the network into several pieces, and then flipping a switch, and suddenly the network is not one connected network, but a lot of small ones. And mining power may be distributed by, maybe contained in these different islands. And you can leverage mining power to do double spend attacks. One island is attacking the other. One is building a different chain than the other because they're not sharing the same chain anymore. Wallets that are following the network may see a sudden decrease in mining power, which would make them maybe not accept transactions. And again, the economic system is paralyzed. So all of these things, I guess I'm kind of worried about somebody with a relatively low budget. I'm not even talking about a country or somebody with a botnet. Somebody who has a very low budget, buys a few IPs on Amazon EC, on different data centers, and just tries to launch this. It's going to be, I think, fairly easy to disrupt connectivity at the moment.
Thank you. I would like to comment on Gill's scenario of perfect coin. Well, on the one hand, if you look at Bitcoin as just Bitcoin, then yeah, for people who hold Bitcoin as an investment, if there's a new coin that dethrones Bitcoin, then it's a problem. But on the other hand, if you view Bitcoin as not just Bitcoin, then if we get this perfect coin that's better than Bitcoin in any way, then mission accomplished. Yes, so that would actually be a good thing if we really want decentralized digital currencies to succeed. What about you guys? Do you have any comments or follow-up questions on any of the issues raised here?
So I don't remember who said this before the panel, but another alternative to perfect coin is a perfect Apple coin or something, a centralized coin that would just be better than Bitcoin, and
Apple Pay?
Yeah, Apple Pay or something of the sort.
So you're saving Gill from getting disqualified.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, about that, I think it relates to what was said, that if PayPal had better terms, maybe there wouldn't be such a strong drive for Bitcoin. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I think the main thing is not whether right now PayPal is bad or traditional currencies are bad. The bigger problem is whether they could be bad. And I think as long as currency is centralized, and as long as everyone trusts on one party, whether it's a government or PayPal or banks or I don't know what, as long as this is the reality, I think the currency and the payment systems have a potential to become bad, and that's a problem. So I don't think any centralized payment system, even if it's relatively good, I don't think it would really, dissolve the need for something like Bitcoin. So anyway, I also want to comment, Peter mentioned some things very related to what I talked about relating to transaction fees and how competitive Bitcoin will be, because it's actually a dual problem. So in order to fight the potential hash rate attacks, then then we need to incentivize miners somehow to mine honestly. So there are actually two problems with that. One is whether we even want to pay so much, because right now, first, the traditional monetary system is, of course, very inefficient, very wasteful, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of energy spent on trafficking physical money. So on the one hand, this has a lot of cost. But Bitcoin mining, relatively to the total value of Bitcoin, is also very wasteful right now. But so, on one hand, in the future where the mining subsidy will be lower, then the relative waste will be lower, but we don't know how much will be enough. So it could be the case that in order to keep Bitcoin secure, we would not need to spend a lot of resources on mining. And this itself is a problem. But the other problem is that even if we as a society agree that Bitcoin mining is the most efficient way to create a currency, then the question remains how to make people actually pay for it. Because, as I said, the expectation is that people will pay transaction fees when they send Bitcoin, but the tragedy of the commons problem means that miners will, okay, well, maybe I should backtrack and say that the marginal cost for a transaction, so the cost of actually processing the transaction, broadcasting it, storing it, and so on, is very small. That's not going to be a major factor later on, especially as technology improves. But the cost of mining will remain high because mining is artificially difficult. So the marginal cost of a transaction could be counted as zero. So it means that for a miner to include a transaction in a block, the cost is zero. So miners will simply include any transaction, and the people who use Bitcoin will not have any incentive to pay transaction fees because their transaction will be put in anyway. So actually the resource here that's being wasted is people's willingness to pay fees. And actually the miners defect the whole system by agreeing to consume this resource and include transactions even though they include very little fees. So if all the miners were a monolithic entity that decides what to do, then it would demand that people pay high fees. But it's not. Every miner does what's best for him. And what's best for each miner individually is to include all transactions.
Well, I mean, I think, of course, I should remember to point out that transaction fees themselves, the marginal cost of including a transaction does not increase the security of Bitcoin. Whatever money went to that cost, which is just overhead, is not money that goes to defending us against 51% attacker. So equally, transaction fees must be higher than the marginal cost for us to have any security, which then implies that you have to have some sort of limit to go drive up that cost, which we already have in terms of the block limit. And of course, some people want to remove the block size limit, which inevitably leads to lower security in the current model. And to me, that just seems like a very fundamental thing, and I think that's generally accepted view in the Bitcoin development community.
Yeah, that's true. But the thing is that a lot of the dialogue that goes around it, I think it's very superficial and naive sometimes, because so for example, the current limit on block size is indeed an indirect way to keep the transaction fees high, but it's not a very efficient way to do it. It creates perverse incentives. Because actually, once we assume, and I think it's okay to assume for the sake of the discussion, that the marginal cost of each transaction is zero, then actually, when I, as a Bitcoin user, want to put my transaction on the block, then actually I don't, it doesn't cost anyone anything. I don't consume any tangible resource by that. But on the other hand, someone has to pay for all the mining because the mining is the same. It doesn't depend on the amount of transactions. It just depends on how much we need to secure Bitcoins against attackers. So someone has to pay it. And it makes sense that whoever gains the most benefit from using Bitcoin will pay the most fees.
Well, I think what's interesting there is you can think of a model where if what's paying for the security of Bitcoin is inflation, which is what is the case right now. You have this really nice model where the entire value of the Bitcoin ecosystem is spent, a certain percentage of the entire value is spent on security every year. And that's a nice clean system where if that number is 1%, well, so long as 1% is an affordable amount of security, the whole thing works. If it's 0.1% and that's an affordable amount of security and it's enough security, the whole thing works. You know, that's a very clean model. Of course, the one problem is we can't actually do that because there is no way to guarantee that the value of Bitcoin is related to the value of the ecosystem. You know, if all people do with Bitcoin is use it as a financial system, that is true. But if people use it as, say, a substrate for other systems on top, such as your colored coins, such as your embedded consensus systems, suddenly the value of it is not related to the value of Bitcoin directly. It may not be related to it at all. Equally, there are incentives if the inflation cost for security is too high for people to go beyond the system and say, well, if I hold Bitcoins, I'm going to lose, say, 5% per year. But if I hold this fancy colored coin that isn't actually backed by anything and acts as a replacement for Bitcoin with no inflation, well, now I don't go pay anything per year. Well, which one are you going to choose? If the technology is good enough, maybe I'll choose this crazy colored coin to avoid inflation.
Yes, this is very true, and it's actually related to a different issue that, well, if we talked about it, the main problem here is that the cost of mining is very high, and it's related to the problem of how to make people pay, because I think if we manage to get the cost of mining of security in the network, if it's low enough, then it probably will be easier to get people to pay this lower amount. So some of the ideas that have been raised were around the concept of proof of stake, which is in its own a very interesting idea. It relies on the notion that the power to synchronize Bitcoin transactions and to potentially attack Bitcoin is given to those with the least incentive to do so. So basically, with proof of stake, the voting power is given to whoever holds coins. Now, the problem here is that it's difficult to determine who is owning the coins, because this model is much less pure than proof of work, because computation is universal. If you do computation, you can apply the same computation to everything. So, for example, there is a concept of merged mining, where you have several alternative coins, each with its own rules, but they all share their mining with one big coin, and it actually could be just as well that they share mining with each other. So you can spend the same amount of work to secure simultaneously a large number of different coins. So this is something you can do with proof of work, but you cannot really do with proof of stake, because each coin has its own idea of who is owning stake. So this is related to Peter's issue that if we want to somehow charge fees which are proportional to the value of the coins, or alternatively to cap the total amount of coins transferred in a block, which will automatically lead to fees being on the order of a proportion of the amount of Bitcoin sent, then this creates a problem if we use Bitcoin in ways which are non-traditional and not the initial thought of every coin representing just a coin.
So I'm wondering, Peter, in 20 or 30 years, when the transactions are dominated by fees and the price of Bitcoin may be decoupled from the value of the system, do you guys think we'll find an equilibrium where the system is secure, or is it already a lost cause that we can now in 2014 close the deal?
I mean, my usual thinking with that is, given that it seems like essentially we can't force people to go pay money for security, it may be that having a very wide variety of systems paying into one proof of work consensus is a good thing. Because at least then, if I'm trying to go attack one system, which is probably true if I'm your average attacker, well, I might have, say, 100 different systems paying in security, and I'll have to essentially simultaneously attack all of them at once. Unfortunately, this doesn't work with merged mining, because with merged mining, your marginal cost to conduct an attack is just whatever you lose by doing the attack. In many cases, this is zero, so there's no reason not to. But at least with embedded consensus systems, it's pretty clear that your cost to do the attack is to attack the proof of work directly, and that gets paid by transaction fees. Will it be enough? Who knows?
Once we have the value detached from Bitcoins and we have color coins and other things taking, say, most of the value, wouldn't miners be able to say, oh, I see you're doing something more worthwhile, I want a bigger fee, otherwise I'm just blocking you out?
Well, of course, now users of those systems have an incentive to ensure they can't be censored and go make their transactions indistinguishable from other transactions.
True, but as long as I can monitor this system externally, because other people want to participate in this system, so it might be possible for miners to recognize them if they're active enough in the other systems.
Well, like I say, most of these systems, you can construct them in ways where no one other than the participants in a given transaction knows what's going on. As an example, you can have a colored coin system where the metadata that determines where color went from input to output is not actually in the transaction, it's committed to in the transaction, say in the, ECC nonce per signature. Well, the miner has no idea what the actual data is, and all they see is a regular Bitcoin transaction.
So it has to be a closed system. Any system that is open, like Bitcoin is, will be able to be monitored and mafiaed.
Even that you can be clever about, because you can use time lock encryption so that you can only figure out what a transaction represented, say, 20 minutes after it's being published. Well, if the miner wants to go mine it in 10 minutes so that they go and get the transaction fee, that doesn't do you any good.
So we've talked a bit about how to incentivize miners, and I assume that the marginal cost of each transaction is 0, but now let's assume that it's not. So every transaction has a cost. Every node on the Bitcoin network needs to get it, to broadcast it, to store it. So this has a cost. It's not very high, but it exists, and someone needs to do it. Now, right now, people, I think, expect that the transaction fees will be what pays for this, but the transaction fees are paid to the miners, and the miners are not the same people who do the heavy lifting of managing all the transactions. So this is an issue, but a few years ago, Aviv Zohar did a research with a paper titled on Bitcoin and red balloons, which dealt with this issue. So Aviv, do you think this is going to be a problem going forward?
So this was really a guess of ours when we began. Moshe Babayov is, by the way, here, a co-author of mine on the paper. We were trying to see what the underlying assumptions of Bitcoin were. And one of the underlying assumptions is not just that every node needs to be able to decide whether a transaction is valid or not and approving transactions, but they even need to learn about the transaction first, right? You need to distribute transactions out to others. I guess that's what you're getting at. So the channels of distribution are another thing that Bitcoin has decentralized, right? And this was technology that was more familiar to us then. General peer-to-peer broadcasting, right? Kind of like BitTorrent was at the time. And what we claimed was that this mechanism was not proof against attacks, in our case by Sybil attacks, right? So Bitcoin's a consensus mechanism is protected against Sybil attacks, but Bitcoin's distribution, block distribution, or transaction distribution are also functions that are important to the protocol. They are not necessarily secured in the same way. In our case, we showed an incentives issue and why you would maybe want not to send transactions forward. But I think in some sense, Bitcoin is slightly centralizing in the distribution as well, right? We have blockchain.info, which a lot of people go to receive information, use their APIs maybe. They are very well connected, so they could very easily become a distributor of blocks and transactions. You could also think of the infrastructure projects like the ones who are aimed at propagating blocks as forming a centralized infrastructure for Bitcoin. So there are a lot of things that Bitcoin's done an initial job at decentralizing, but nobody knows if that will necessarily hold. And I think that's where it could actually be regulated if it does centralize along these lines.
I mean, I think my response to the Red Balloons paper was pretty much adding all this information to have payments per transaction. It's certainly much easier to simply make the assumption, well, if we just make sure that's cheap enough that people essentially do it out of a hobby, that's probably actually your safer route. It's not a very pretty solution, but if you ensure that anyone can go fire up a node for a few dollars worth of time, that ends up working pretty well. And equally, the diversity of ways you can move information around the network means that, well, network level attacks are certainly very easy. If you conduct one, well, people will start getting their pet passenger pigeons to, shuffle blocks around. And as absurd as it sounds, well, yeah, there's a lot of solutions like that. You can get on a ham radio, you can do all sorts of things. And that keeps those attacks less feasible. On the other hand, again, if we want to go scale Bitcoin up, suddenly these attacks look feasible more and more as the cost to propagate information goes up.
So I'm really worried about somebody trying to even monopolize transmission of transactions. Let's say there's a node that says, if you send your transactions just to me and not to anyone else, I'll give you a discount on the fees. And they wipe out the competition by just receiving all of the transaction fees. So in some sense, is the distribution of transactions proof against these sorts of attacks? This is an economic attack in this case. But so Bitcoin is aimed to, right, the basic aim was to put in a very low cost publishing mechanism, like you said. Everybody forwards these really small transactions and just floods them to the network, and you just need to listen and you get it. But I'm not sure if it'll really stay that way, and we might find out differently if somebody tries to really attack it.
I'm wondering, other than Gill's vector, all of us were talking about attacks against the Bitcoin network. Do you guys think that one of the technological threats is just going to be some kind of natural scalability problem, or is it merely attacks against the network that are threatening us?
So I think there's going to be a scalability wall that's going to be hit at some point. It's not necessarily a wall, but it's definitely a slippery slope. Once I think blocks start to grow, if it's not done conservatively, like I suppose Gavin now is suggesting a very conservative path, but if, let's say, adoption really grows quickly and block size doesn't grow, then fees will jump up. And if block size suddenly grows very quickly, we're going to see a very strong decrease in security. People might lose faith in the currency. It might be too late to implement software changes because these need to be done over time. And when I'm talking about a big adoption, this really can happen overnight. This is something that could happen. And another thing that also scares me is what happens if a lot of people just start using light nodes, and they put strain on the current system of nodes and they just require their headers of information. If you talk to some people who have tried to work with light nodes, you'll see that it's very hard to start them up. They need to download a lot of headers at first. So there's going to be an increasing problem. The infrastructure might become overloaded if we suddenly see a lot of adoption, I think.
In the context of scalability, I think it's important to realize that the solutions wouldn't come just out of ways to put more transactions on the Bitcoin network, but also to gain more mileage out of each transaction. So that's exactly where micropayment channels kick in. So micropayment channels allows you to set up a small number of transactions and open up a channel that allows you to send multiple payments. So maybe we will not have enough room in the blockchain for everyone to do a transaction, but we will have enough room for everyone to send payments through a channel. And you can take this channel primitive and build the networks out of it, where I can pay anyone I want immediately, any amount without almost any cost. I would have to use some sort of intermediary, but it's relatively zero trust because I don't need to deposit my money anywhere. I just need to lock it in a channel that is still under my control.
I mean, keep in mind, my position on that is these ways of achieving scalability without using the blockchain directly, your biggest threat is they're actually likely to work really, really well. And people are quite likely to go use them for the vast majority of transactions, and you will not see very many transactions actually happen. It's also why I don't think all this discussion about raising the block size may ever even come to fruition. We may never see the actual, even as users scale up, we may never see transaction fees get to the point where there finally is consensus to actually raise the block size. At every step, there's so many economic incentives to go build better systems to take transactions off the blockchain that nothing may happen.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. So let's open up to some questions from the audience. Let's use the microphone to Riel. Yes, so any questions?
What do you think about the development of financial products that enable you to have a large short position on Bitcoin, and what threats that can bring? And is there anything that you can do to stop that?
I don't think we want to stop it. I mean, it's the maturity of every system that once you have a product, you'll have financial instruments on that product, and I don't see it as a threat. It may raise the incentive of said attacker to want to attack the system if he can short it, but I just think it's a sign of maturity of a system.
Yeah, so that's actually relevant, because when people talk about hash rate attacks, the usual problem that they talk about is double spending, but double spending is not really a problem. I think the bigger problem is the denial of service attacks, and shorting is a problem in the sense that someone can short Bitcoins and then do an attack on Bitcoin. So that is a challenge, but I don't think it's a reason to prevent shorting, because that's a natural phenomenon in any financial system.
So I think it's not actually a bad thing. Somebody who's shorting the Bitcoin network gives you a strong economic signal that, he brings down the value of Bitcoin. He signals to you that Bitcoin is not secure even before he does the attack. So, if he does the attack, let's say Bitcoin is going to crash. He's giving you that value, that information, truthfully before. Of course, he's making a lot of money along the way, but if Bitcoin collapses, somebody's always making money, right? Somebody's holding, left holding paper, or in this case, bits on servers that become worthless, and everybody who's just not is making money. So this guy is going to tell you that there's something wrong in the system.
Well, I'll point out kind of the reverse. In some cases, you can make money by taking the opposite position to the shorts and ensuring Bitcoin doesn't fail.
Coming from the old financial system, I think that the shorting Bitcoin is actually very good. It stabilizes the coin, and let's say you want to manipulate the coin, and you go into a huge short on Bitcoin, and then try an attack. There might be somebody else bigger than you catching your short and then destroying you. Okay, so it goes both ways, ensuring more stability for the price, in my opinion.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
And the mic. So it's about the perfect coin. We've seen all these altcoins experiment over the last few years, and it's a great idea. Now, it's maybe for Peter. How upgradable do you think Bitcoin is in practice, right? We see all these features. We want to incorporate some of them. Is Bitcoin development actually grinding down to a halt, or will we see continued progress over the next 5-10 years as new features are incorporated?
I'll go point out that essentially the Bitcoin core development team was very, very angry at Mike Kern for saying Bitcoin development was grinding to a halt. There was a lot of ill will generated by that. And on the other hand, protocol development, we haven't seen that many changes to the Bitcoin protocol itself. I think that is just a matter of caution that people have. And there has been a lot of work that's been done that's not related to forking Bitcoin. I think we're going to see that in the near future. I've pull requested myself to go do a forking change, and SIPA does as well. So we'll find out, really. But technically, it's definitely possible to do nearly anything as an upgrade.
Can anyone comment on the 1 million coins that are sitting still from 5-6 years ago that even if 1/100th of it will move, it can crash the economy?
I don't agree with that at all. I suspect if we saw all million get sold, the price would go to zero, and a lot of people would think, hey, cheap coins, and the price would rebound again within a few weeks. I think the markets are deeper than you might expect.
Okay, so that's all the time we have today. So thank you everyone. Thank you to all my fellow panelists. So